Now for today's program. Harry Castleman is a lawyer specializing in business, real estate, probate, and intellectual property law in Boston. He has co-authored 9 popular culture books with Walter Podrazik, focusing on the history of television and the Beatles. He previously worked as a media producer for the Democratic National Committee, press secretary for the Florida Democratic Party, and as a media consultant to political campaigns both nationally and in Florida. Harry has been a guest lecturer on TV history at Boston University's College of Communication and has been interviewed on radio and television stations concerning television and music history. Walter J. Podrazik is a respected television historian, analyst, and media planner. He is an adjunct lecturer at the Department of Communication at the University of Illinois at Chicago, where he has taught courses on future TV, television history, and the intersection of mass media and politics. Walter has experienced firsthand history in the making, handling media logistics at such high-profile events as the Democratic Party's quadrennial presidential nominating conventions, and as part of both inaugurals of President Bill Clinton. Walter is co-author of 10 books, 9 of them with Harry Castleman, including the television history Watching TV. Walter was among the on-camera expert voices in the CNN Decades miniseries, the 90s and the 2000s. Walter is a member of the board of directors of the Library of American Broadcasting Foundation and serves as a television curator at the Museum of Broadcast Communications in Chicago. Please welcome Harry Castleman and Walter J. Podrazik.
The leadership of 3 visionary Jewish pioneers created the business of television. David Sarnoff at NBC, William Paley at CBS, and Leonard Goldenson at ABC. They brought the medium to a position of unquestioned influence in American life by the mid-1960s. The stage was built. Then the next generation stepped in to take that vision even further. We're going to look at 4 gifted Jewish leaders in the medium: Fred Silverman, Brandon Tartikoff, Barry Diller, and Sumner Redstone. And we'll start with Fred Silverman. Silverman was responsible for introducing iconic shows and characters and programming techniques on CBS, ABC, and NBC. And the bottom line was Silverman, through all of these, had a sense of what would connect with mainstream television viewers. And he made his first marks in my hometown of Chicago. Silverman was born in 1937 in New York City. Mom was Catholic, dad was Jewish, and he clearly indicated his area of interest and expertise with his master's degree at Ohio University in 1959. His master's thesis analyzed ABC programming through the 1950s, and that led to his hiring at WGN-TV in Chicago, my home. And at WGN, he displayed his gift for programming, especially seeing the potential for presenting material in ways that would connect with audiences. Cartoons for kids, very, very, very tuned in to the attraction of cartoons. Daytime Bugs Bunny breakfast puppet and cartoon show. He knew that viewers were looking for the comfortable, the familiar, and the accessible. But they were also open to different approaches, to ideas that might surprise him. They just had to be led into them. And no one was better at leading viewers to something that they didn't even realize they were interested in than Fred Silverman. In 1962, Fred Silverman looked at the host of a very popular Chicago children's television show called Garfield Goose. Fraser Thomas was the person who played the prime minister to a goose who thought he was the king of the United States. And it was a very popular kid show, connected with kids, connected with families. And so Silverman said, all right, let's hang up your prime minister's costume, put on your grown-up suit, and we're going to take you to prime time. And what they did is Fraser Thomas became the host in that fall of 1962 of Family Classics. The setting was the total opposite of a kid's show. You had an overstuffed chair, impressive library, a little hint of Garfield Goose with a picture hanging in the background, original piece of artwork by a gentleman by the name of Roy Brown, who was part of the Garfield Goose family. And what Fraser Thomas introduced to viewers was a primetime feature film presentation of such classics as Robin Hood, Treasure Island, Captain Blood, historical dramas like Young Mr. Lincoln. And these proved very popular. But the real genius of Fred Silverman was not just taking a kids show host and putting him in prime time. It was taking 25-year-old movies that they already had on the shelf and figuring out a way to package them into a successful primetime bit of programming. In fact, it was so successful that the regular television networks, ABC, CBS, and NBC, because WGN was an independent, said, that's a good idea. And so they started doing a little bit more of that on their own. And soon Family Classics slipped over to what became its home, which was Sunday afternoons, where it ran for decades. Fred Silverman, in turn, took the journey to the big leagues. He went to New York, he went to CBS. And at CBS, he was put in charge of overseeing the network's daytime programming. And that was, in the case of CBS, a mix of cartoons, soap operas, situation comedy reruns, and a couple of oddball items, news, etc. And he was absolute expert at maximizing what was on the air for people to tune in. And he gave CBS, in its daytime programming, solid, reliable revenue source. So even though the network in primetime was doing well, if it had some rough spots, had a little dip and such, they could always count on the fact that CBS daytime was delivering the goods. He was only 25 when CBS put him in charge. And in his early 30s, he stepped up. In 1970, he stepped up and was put in charge of all the entertainment programming at CBS. And this was part of the network attempting to move forward, to step away from what had been very successful, a series of rural-based comedies, dramas, and such. And they were looking to get a more contemporary, a younger, a more urban audience, a more connected to the real world audience. And Silverman actually delighted at the challenge that that provided. And what he did is stepped in and was the perfect person to really kick this off with All in the Family, which was a mid-season replacement from the 1970 to 71 season, premiered in January. And appropriately, ironically, or in a challenge to viewer expectations, it was slotted in the programming schedule on the same night as the Beverly Hillbillies, Green Acres, and Hee Haw aired. You go from that to All in the Family. And it was not an immediate hit, but Silverman, one of his gifts is spotting what works and being patient and knowing that if you give people enough time to get to know it, if it's any good, they will probably embrace it. And so as soon as All in the Family, which is only a half season, first season, finished its first run, immediately ran into an instant cycle of reruns of the entire season. To that point, only 13 episodes. And by the fall, the talk had fed the viewership. And in the next season, it's only its second season, All in the Family began 5 consecutive seasons as the #1 program on network television. And again, a reminder that we're talking about an era of television in which there were only 3 major network sources and you can't videotape. So what the programmer did, what Fred Silverman, an enthusiastic fan of TV, what he brought to the equation was, let me show you what you might enjoy, why you might enjoy it, and here's another chance to do it again. So over the next few years, Silverman used this new approach for CBS programming, also recognizing the previous rural audience with programs like the Waltons and such. And he was supervisor, he was the host, he was the presenter of some of the memorable television series of the 1970s. He used spin-offs, he used cross-promotion, he used every trick, and what he did was built a strong, loyal audience. Here are some of the programs. Besides All in the Family were the spin-offs. There was Maude, there was Good Times, there was The Jeffersons. On another, this is all from the Norman Lear School of Production. On the other side of the ledger was the Mary Tyler Moore MTM production. It started with the Mary Tyler Moore Show, but also had its own spin-offs of Rhoda, Lou Grant, the first MTM hour-long drama, on Phyllis, and others that had nothing to do with Mary Tyler Moore's show, but were MTM productions. So all of that was the core. And in addition, of course, Silverman was well-rounded, and he made sure that there were good cartoons and there were good dramas and there were good engaging programs. And he was the strong spark that kept CBS at the top of the charts. And then maybe he was feeling underappreciated. There was an anecdote that, a quote that Harry and I like, which was that one more limousine.
Must be Fred Silverman.
Fred Silverman just called and wanted to correct me.
Yeah.
Incessantly. My apologies. Back to the story.
One more limousine.
One more limousine, and he might have stayed home. Instead, what that really meant was a little more responsibility, a little more recognition. And ABC was ready to give him that recognition. So ABC invited him to be president of ABC Entertainment. That began in June of 1975. And the dramatic change here is Silverman was at the #1 network on television, and ABC was #3, and not even a close #3.
Right.
And so he came in and didn't really change much of what they had in terms of, here's the programs you're going to put in the fall, but he knew how to present the programs that were already there, and he looked for things that would match and would encourage viewer loyalty. Best example would be Happy Days, which already existed, but he said, let's promote the character, Henry Winkler's character of the Fonz. That should be the hook that draws people in, and it was. And there was the same formula that had worked at CBS, but now with a different cluster, because with CBS, he had gone from going, let's go from rural to urban. This is going from old to young, essentially. Let's have stuff that just feels fresher, a little more cutting edge, a little more fun. And so you had Happy Days and its spin-offs, which would include Laverne and Shirley and Mork and Mindy. And then there were other shows, Charlie's Angels, Three's Company, which became the collective symbol of Jiggle TV. And in fact, the most important part, though, seemed to be Fred Silverman himself as an outgoing personality who would say, you should watch these shows. My apologies.
Yeah, I unplugged my phone.
Yeah, I should have done that. Anyway, so what Fred Silverman did is basically Charlie's Angels made the cover of Time magazine, but so did Fred Silverman, the man with the golden gut. And in his presentation of ABC's material, he built an audience for that material as well, deftly programming every opportunity he had to lure people in with what he saw as a strong lineup for programming. And that had a wide range, included things like novels for television. It included the daring concept of, when the Olympic Games began, scrapping the entire primetime summer schedule and filling every slot with the Olympics and winning every slot with the Olympics. And so in the space of one season, ABC went from number 3 to number 1 and forever cemented in the public's mind Fred Silverman as a programming miracle man. He stayed at ABC through 1978, and maybe it was hubris, maybe it was just, let me go for the trifecta. And he was lured to NBC beginning in June of 1978. And he had a much more difficult task there, because he finally found his most formidable opposition, Fred Silverman, because there were still remnants of the Fred Silverman schedule on CBS, and there were certainly ABC at its peak on the ABC schedule, and Fred Silverman had to try to counter-program himself, and he couldn't pull that off overnight. So that ended up being 2 for 3, 2 out of 3. He didn't quite make it, and he instead achieved such markers as Super Train. This would be Love Boat on land. Well, it's on land. There's no beautiful ocean. There's no swimming pool. Why? And the thing is, he wasn't necessarily far off in trying to plug some programs in. He just had too many holes, and it was just too deep for him to, in 1 or 2 seasons, completely turn it around. So let's just say it didn't work, but instead focus on what he did bring to NBC. He was already looking ahead. And some of his legacy at NBC was he made sure that David Letterman remained on the NBC payroll even after a daytime talk show had flopped. So he kept David Letterman on reserve for later use. He brought the Smurfs to the NBC daytime schedule. Now that sounds like, well, big deal. What's the Smurfs? It's just, he knew that let's do something different with cartoons. And probably most impressive for the legacy of NBC was he gave the okay for Hill Street Blues. Hill Street Blues not only got on the schedule, but even after dismal ratings, he renewed it for a second season, one of his last efforts. I say last efforts because he didn't get picked up after at the end of his 3-year contract. He also did something else. He brought in some new corporate management, including a gentleman by the name of Brandon Tartikoff. And then he went off into his own production company and had tremendous success there because he didn't have to do a whole network. He just had to do shows that could be placed on any network or in syndication, and they did very well. And I'm going to read a number of the titles because they all have something in common. He did Raymond Burr with a revival of Perry Mason, Andy Griffith with a new character called Matlock. He did William Conrad, who goes way back in broadcast history to Gunsmoke, in Jake and the Fat Man, Carol O'Connor in The Heat of the Night, Tom Bosley in The Father Dowling Mysteries, and Dick Van Dyke in Diagnosis Murder. What Silverman knew is what sells and what people want to see are characters and performers they care about. They like comfort, they like reliability, and no one was better at delivering it than Fred Silverman. Harry, your turn.
Well, thank you. It's a great lead-in because you mentioned who I'm going to be talking about, Brandon Tartikoff, who is interesting because in some ways he is similar to Fred Silverman, but different. You might almost say he's sort of like the younger brother, because Tartikoff is 12 years younger than Fred Silverman. Tartikoff was born in 1949 to a Jewish family on Long Island, the South Shore of Long Island, a commuter suburb. He graduated from Yale. It's funny because his highlights of his career is in many ways very similar to Silverman's. He wound up at a TV station in Chicago, not WGN, but WLS, the ABC station. He was working on program promotion. And just very similar to what Wally was talking about, Fred Silverman, same issue that Tartikoff faced. How is he going to promote these old moldy programs that WLS is airing in its local material, not the network stuff, but their local stuff like in the afternoon or so forth. And so they have a bunch of kind of moldy guerrilla films that had come out in the 40s and 50s, some from Japan. And he decided to package them all together and promote them as the Guerrilla My Dreams week. And it did very well. It got a lot of attention, and that managed to get people's attention about him, about Brandon Tartikoff. And that's where his interaction with Fred Silverman comes in, because Silverman, who was then at ABC, hires Tartikoff as a program executive in 1976. But Tartikoff wasn't there very long. He was only there at ABC for 1 year, moved to NBC in 77. But as Wally just explained, he's reunited with Fred Silverman in 78 when Silverman comes over and becomes NBC president. What Silverman did is he named Brandon Tartikoff to be the head of NBC Entertainment. That is the chief programmer, the position that Silverman had held at CBS and then at ABC. At the time Tartikoff became NBC's programming chief, he was 31 years old, and he was the youngest to hold that post at that time. The difference between Tartikoff and Silverman is interesting. The 12-year age difference is very interesting, and that Tartikoff is really one of the first baby boomer TV programming executives. He grew up on TV. Silverman had a love for television. In Tartikoff, it was sort of in his blood. And also the difference is that, like Silverman, he was very good at being able to figure out what would be appealing to the audience. But the knock on Silverman might be, and particularly in his later years, would be that Silverman would put anything on the air if he thought it would get eyeballs. Hence programs like Super Train or Manimal or some other fortunately forgotten programs that we won't delve into. Tartikoff, and this is kind of hard to put your finger on it, was a little bit more just thinking of what can we do to really get something innovative on the air. I mean, yes, Silverman had promoted and championed All in the Family, but Tartikoff really had an amazing record of bringing quality programs to NBC. Okay, so he becomes chief programmer in NBC. NBC, just like when Silverman was at ABC, NBC is then in last place, is sort of the laughing stock of TV at that point. They only had 3 shows in the top 20 when there's only 3 networks. There was Little House on the Prairie, which is a good show, Different Strokes, okay, and then Real People, which fortunately we've mostly forgotten about. Slowly things picked up. Freddie, as Wally explained, Freddie left NBC in 81 and was replaced by Grant Tinker, who had been from the MTM studios, the people behind Hill Street Blues. Wally and I's stories directly overlap. Yes, in my version of it, it's Brandon Tartikoff who renewed Hill Street Blues. It's just that Fred Silverman approved it. And that was one of his last acts at NBC. Hill Street Blues had really been very bad. It had premiered in January of 81. It had gotten great critical praise, but had been 87th out of the 96 shows of that season. It was the lowest rated show ever at that time to be renewed for a second season. But Tartikoff stuck with it, supported it. It lasted 7 years. It never really was a huge smash hit. It sort of made it into the top 20 barely, but it was a solid performer, and it was a prestige program that really marked the era of a whole different type of TV programming, of a more like a novelistic approach to TV drama than you had seen in the past. That was in 81. '82, the next season, Tartikoff's talents really come forward. It's a fabulous year for new NBC programs. All shows that Tartikoff approved, championed, got on the air. Family Ties, Cheers, Remington Steele, Saint Elsewhere, among others. Those are all new shows on NBC in 1982. They all took time to catch on, but they all did. And that's the other thing. Well, I'll tell you about that in a second. In '84, Tartikoff pursued Bill Cosby, someone we don't hear about much anymore. Tartikoff had seen Cosby telling stories as a guest host on The Tonight Show. Brings up The Cosby Show in '84. Cosby was no stranger to sitcoms. There had already been The Bill Cosby Show, The New Bill Cosby Show, Cos, a couple of others. The Cosby Show becomes a huge hit. It saved sitcoms for a while because at that time it seemed like sitcoms were on the way out. And the other thing that I think really needs to be mentioned is that as Wally mentioned, there was several Black-related shows that had been in that era. There was the Jeffersons, there was Sanford and Son, but all of those shows presented the Black characters either as living in the ghetto or having just made it out of the ghetto and so forth. And here you've got The Cosby Show, where you've got an upper middle class Black family, which was something that had never been seen on TV before. Cosby Show was #1 for 5 years on TV and really took off NBC in terms of ratings. The next thing, also the same year, '84, Tartikoff came up with this concept. He just wrote the words MTV Cops and handed it to Anthony Yerkovich, who was a writer-producer from Hill Street Blues. And he said, run with it. Yerkovich turns that memo, if you want to call that a memo, into Miami Vice, which did mix cops with an MTV feel, using kind of, rock music as background and so forth. And the images of the show were almost as enticing as the program itself. It became something of a cultural icon. It was a top 10 hit briefly, and really was also became a very, stylistic show that caught on. A few years later, Tartikoff was backing Seinfeld, which started in '89. Also began with very weak ratings. It didn't become a real smash till its 5th season, but he stuck with it. Now, you can always say that. I mean, sometimes that theory works and sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes you stick with something and it doesn't work. We always tend to mention it when it does work. But that was clearly the case with Seinfeld. Silverman did that a little bit, but in his later years, particularly at NBC, Silverman was kind of known as someone who would pull a show after like 3 weeks and move the schedule all over the place and so forth. And he really had given up that ability of hanging on. And Tartikoff was a little better than that, I would think. And it paid off with all these hits. NBC got better and better during his reign, first just critically, but then with the ratings. NBC actually solidly won the 1985-86 season. Believe it or not, as though NBC had always been one of the big two with CBS, with ABC behind, that 85-86 season was the first clear season win by NBC since 1951, which was when I Love Lucy came on the air. NBC won the season ratings battle during Tartikoff's last 6 years as chief programmer. They started referring to the primetime schedule as must-see TV, though that is often used more in connection with their hit Thursday night lineup in the late 80s, which had, at least at Eastern time, Cosby Show at 8, its spin-off Different World at 9, Cheers, Different World at 8:30, Cheers at 9, Don't Ask About 9:30, we'll skip over that, and LA Law at 10 o'clock. And so, he left NBC on top in '91 and briefly went over to Paramount Pictures, where he was in charge of that, but he didn't last long. Unfortunately, going backwards, back when he was with WLS, he was first diagnosed with Hodgkin's lymphoma. He took chemotherapy, it was cured, but it came back later. later, and eventually it caught up with him, and he died in August of '97 at only age 48. So he was one of the first baby boomer program executives, top executives on TV. He was also, unfortunately, one of the first to pass away.
Barry Diller is still with us.
Yes.
In fact, Harry, you and I were talking before we began this session that all the people we've talked about in part one and today are deceased except for Barry Diller. Barry Diller was born back in 1942, Jewish household in San Francisco. And his entree to the entertainment business was through the Hollywood prism. He was, yes, a mail clerk at the William Morris Agency. Even if that's not true, it should be. But yes, he was a mail clerk there and would read memos and stuff in his spare time. And more important, he understood the potential for TV to expand further with its Hollywood connections. In 1964, he joined ABC as an assistant to a gentleman by the name of Elton Rule, who was then the West Coast head of ABC, and he journeyed with him to New York. And Diller was put in charge of negotiating broadcast rights for feature films that were run on the network. Now that was a big draw. It was something special. That is, the networks used that as we have the premiere of the movie that you wanted to see, and now we've got it in the convenience of your own home. And what that helped Diller to develop is a real sense of the value of a movie. And more important, the cost of acquiring that movie. And it didn't take too long for the dollars and cents to add up. And he became the champion of what became known as made-for-TV movies. Now, he didn't create the first made-for-TV movie, but he created it as a cornerstone for a network's strategies. And I love a quote that I found in the New York Times Encyclopedia of Television by writer Les Brown, who noted that at one point, as the executive in charge of multiple made-for-TV movie nights, that Barry Diller was responsible for more movies in a year than any individual Hollywood studio released theatrically. He knew that area, and so it wasn't that much of a logical jump for him to go to the pure movie side. So he became he went from ABC to become chairman of Paramount Pictures for about 10 years. And he was there from 1974 to 1984. And while the studio was producing the hit television programs like Laverne and Shirley and Taxi and Cheers, and it was on his watch, so he could bask in that success. And then 1984, he switched studios again. He went to 20th Century Fox, when Rupert Murdoch had taken over. And Murdoch charged Diller with, we're going to have another network. I want to do another network. That's why Rupert Murdoch was piecing together station purchases and such. And so he put it to Diller to figure out, okay, put something on it. And Diller, of course, drawing on his familiarity with all aspects of Hollywood. By then he had a packed Rolodex. And so he was able to get until about 1992, he helped Fox get off the ground. There were signature shows. There were many, many shows that are lost to the ether. But amongst them, to give an example of the variety, you have the Married with Children, but you also had The Simpsons. But The Simpsons was preceded by the Tracy Ullman Show. And that's the type of connection that someone with an international view of television, with a wider view of television, could say, give a person whom most US viewers have never heard of and give her a TV slot. and The Simpsons started as a little featurette on that. Though, as the lawyers would be quick to point out, it was not officially a spin-off of the Tracy Ullman Show, but it was its own creative entity. So one of the strengths I think that Barry Diller has is seeing a few steps ahead. So if you look at his career, I think it's best summarized by the way the Encyclopedia Britannica website takes it. First sentence was, Barry Diller is an American businessman, and he's been CEO and head of many companies. Between the two of us, Harry and I have said, how does Barry Diller turn up in everything? A short checklist. He invested in QVC, home shopping, USA, Vivendi. He even put in a bid for Paramount Pictures, but he lost out to Viacom. A little foreshadowing in a moment. He had, sometimes the investments didn't work out. He had an investment in Aereo, which was designed to give TV viewers streaming access to broadcast television over their portable devices. Ran into some legal copyright issues and such, but the vision was correct. He knew that that's how people wanted to have access to television, not by tuning into a network, but by tuning into what they wanted to see when they wanted to see it. He continues to be a force in so many areas of entertainment. Currently, he has served as chairman and senior executive of IAC Interactive Corp and the Expedia Group. And he's also been strongly in real estate and philanthropy. I couldn't believe when I first started looking up what he's doing lately, I run into just last month, there was the Little Island Park and Performance Space at Hudson River Park, which he unveiled and was the brains behind. He was a supporter, has been a supporter of the New York High Line, and he very much is an active part of the broadcast media entertainment industry. And like so many of the others that we've talked about, he actually has sown the seeds and introduced people to the corporate public by being part of his projects. And so you have names like Michael Eisner and Dawn Steele and Jeffrey Katzenberg and many others who came under the tutelage or the introductory force of Barry Diller. So, and for those wondering, Diller is married to Diane von Furstenberg and is a, according to his bio, member of the Democratic Party and supporter of related political causes. He's an activist, he's a philanthropist, and he has figured out every way possible to profit from the entertainment industry, and our collective hats are off to him for that.
Okay, into the final of the four people we're looking at, Sumner Redstone, who really, in the first part a few months ago, Wally and I talked about some of the founders of the media world we know, mentioning Bill Paley and David Sarnoff. Sumner Redstone is closest of the people we're talking about today to the Paley-Sarnoff type. He is truly a media mogul. Born in 1923 in Boston, he was known as Sumner Rothstein at that time. His father, Michael, changed the family name to Redstone in 1940. I didn't realize till I looked this up that Redstone apparently is the literal translation of the German Yiddish word Rothstein, name Rothstein. So there you go. You learn something every day. His father, Michael, had founded the National Amusements Company in 1936 in Dedham, Mass., not too far away from me, which was a chain of movie theaters. The headquarters of National Amusements is still like 5 miles away in Norwood. Sumner Redstone graduated from Harvard in 44, served in the Army, got a Harvard Law degree in 47, After a couple of years in the mid-50s, he joins the family business and joins Northeast National Amusements, working for his dad, and eventually replaces his dad as CEO in 1967. National Amusements first was focusing on drive-ins, but Sumner Redstone saw that that was a dead end and moved to get rid of the drive-ins and move toward the multiplex theaters that we're familiar with today. What makes Redstone important was that very early on, he saw that media content would be more important and valuable than the mechanics of distribution. That is, what was shown, films, TV shows, ultimately would be more significant than where it was shown, how it was shown, theaters, TV stations. And so in 1994, he coined the phrase, content is king, although Bill Gates usually gets credited for that. In the old days back then, there were very few gatekeepers in the world of media. There were a few big theater chains. There were only 3 networks. The internet changed all that, and Redstone really saw where that was going. And so the content is king mantra guided his professional career, made him a billionaire and one of the world's most powerful media moguls. And it became a guiding philosophy, not just for him, but for the entire entertainment industry these days. Just look at what was in the news the last few weeks. Warner Brothers being acquired by Discovery Inc., Amazon trying to purchase the MGM studios and its library. That's all being done because of their content. When you've got a big pipeline of the internet, you need a lot of material to send out on that pipeline. And without a lot of good content, people are going to ignore whatever you're doing. And so that's why content is so important these days, and Redstone saw that. I do want to mention a near fatal experience that he had, which was very interesting, showing what kind of person he was. The night of March 29th, 79, he was sleeping in the 3rd floor room of a Copley Plaza hotel here in Boston. And during the night, a disgruntled employee set a fire that swept through the hotel. Redstone couldn't get out by going through the door because there was fire out in the hallway. The only way he survived was crawling out the window onto a thin ledge and hanging onto the ledge with his right arm while flames were lapping at his hand and his arm and his body. He held on that ledge for what he said felt like forever. And he said he simply refused to let go because if he did, it would be almost certain death. He was a very fiercely competitive guy, strong willpower, and sure enough, eventually a fire truck got there, rescued him. However, he was severely burned, over 45% of his body, needed 30 hours of surgery. He always bore the scars of that burn, especially on his right hand and his arm. He sued the hotel, he won a multi-million-dollar verdict, and he donated that entire verdict to the Mass General Burn Center that had treated him. Unlike everybody else we've talked about, here's somebody that actually I have a personal connection with. I got to know him soon thereafter. I was a law student at Boston University. Redstone was then just a local media executive, not very well known to the public. He was teaching one of the first law school courses in entertainment law, including protection of intellectual property rights and so forth. Well, the first thing we all noticed about him, because we didn't really know who he was what's the deal with his hand? Because you could all see that he had had a burned hand. And of course, before the internet, this is in the early 80s, there was no easy way to find out, and stories began circulating as to how he got burned and so forth. And we eventually got pretty much the right story. And so that was right away something very interesting about this guy. But what was more important was, and this is a whole topic, but there's a huge difference between what you learn in law school and what professors teach you in law school and what you find out in the real world, in the world of law, practicing in law when you get out of law school. I was used to, by this time, I don't think I took him in my 2nd or 3rd year, I don't recall. And I was used to the usual law school professor dealing with the theoretical nature of law, which is, fascinating. You need to learn it. Redstone was a very practical guy. Right away, I could see this is a guy who knows his stuff and is telling you exactly not just how in theory it is, but how it is in the real world. And that was very impressive. And I was very taken by him and thought, well, this is a guy who really is going somewhere. He was already pretty old, but any event, I was quite taken with him. I did pretty well in the course. I came in 2nd. in that course. I missed getting the top grade by a half a point. The guy who beat me out by half a point then went to work for Redstone and is still working for the company. He's general counsel for National Amusements, and he's a very nice guy, and he's helped us in a couple of things. Any event, soon after graduating, I graduated from law school. Redstone, through National Amusements, became a national figure. He launched a hostile takeover bid for Viacom, the company that owned the CBS filmed programs, which originally had been part of CBS. It was then spun off in '71 because of an FCC rule. And in a bitter battle, but National Amusements wins. And in 1987, he gets control of Viacom. What does Viacom have at that point? Hawaii Five-0, Gunsmoke, I Love Lucy, Star Trek, The Cosby Show, we just mentioned. It's content. That's what they had. Viacom also had the new fad back then, cable channels, MTV, Nickelodeon, Showtime. And he moved MTV from just music videos to more reality shows like Real World. During his watch, the late night talk show Jon Stewart Show begins on MTV. Nickelodeon developed some really classic cartoons like Rugrats, Doug, SpongeBob SquarePants. As Wally mentioned, 1994, Redstone and National Amusements outbids the very heavily favored and 20-year younger Barry Diller to take over Paramount Pictures. Under Redstone's control, Paramount turns out Saving Private Ryan, Titanic, Forrest Gump, and so forth. Then in 2000, Redstone completes the formation of his true media conglomerate by acquiring CBS, reuniting it with Viacom. So you've got the CBS network, Viacom, Paramount Pictures, other cable channels, radio stations, TV production companies that do Oprah Winfrey, Wheel of Fortune, and Jeopardy. And so that's it. He has this huge empire. Going back to our first speech a couple months ago, he's like Bill Paley. He's this media tycoon, but there's always a question of succession. Who's going to succeed him? Redstone had a parade of heir apparents that all fell by the wayside. I won't bother mentioning them, it takes too long. In 2004, Redstone told Larry King in an interview, he says, "I have no intention of retiring or of dying." And that's the way he acted. He acted like he was never going to leave. And so his personal life was a little messy. He's married and divorced a few times, some live-in girlfriends that sued him for money or control of his assets. Eventually, his daughter, Sherry, who also went to BU Law School a little before me, emerged as his designated heir. The father and daughter, they're very similar. They squabbled publicly about a number of things about the company. In the end, Sumner, who was well into his 90s, was failing physically and mentally. There were a lot of people who were circling around trying to take over the business. And in the end, Sherry took control of the company and deftly eliminated all opponents to her grabbing the crown of head of National Amusements. And in 2019, CBS and Viacom, which had briefly split up yet again, although they had always been under Redstone control, were reunited thanks to the driving force of Sherry, who is without a doubt her father's daughter. 9 months later, in August 2020, Sumner Redstone finally dies at 97, but Sherry is still in control. It is a family business, just like in the old days. The TV world of 20 years ago, when Redstone acquired CBS, with just broadcast and cable networks, is gone these days, and everything is moving towards streaming. And of course, streaming began with like YouTube, Netflix, and Hulu in the early 2000s, but it was CBS under Redstone that was the first US broadcast network to launch its own streaming service, which the industry calls OTT, over the top. It's like directly to consumers. They launched it in October 2014, called CBS All Access. Hasn't been a big player in the streaming world, but it was there. And it was just a few months ago, it was rebranded as Paramount Plus with a lot of publicity after the reunion again of CBS and Viacom, proving again the wisdom of Redstone's mantra that content is king. And that's our story.
Thank you both so much for that overview. It was really fascinating. And for everybody who has not seen their Harry and Wally's first episode, you can find that on our website. And when we do a follow-up email later this week, we'll include the link to that. We have time for a few questions. The first one is, aside from Redstone's daughter, were there any other women involved as executives in the 70s, 80s, and 90s?
Wally, you have an answer for that?
I would say the short answer is yes, though I think you have to look more towards the movie studio portion of the equation. I mean, I gave an example or two, but once you get into the production world, you also find names like Susan Harris, for instance.
Yes.
Came out of the Norman Lear School of production. And so yes, but not anywhere near what you would have hoped for. I mean, one of my one of the women I admire in the very early days of television, and also going back into feature films, was one of the four stars of Four Star Productions. And I'm sorry, I just blanked on her name. So Harry, you could.
Well, there was also, of course, don't forget, Linda Bloodworth Thomason, who was behind shows like Designing Women and a series of other ones. Turned out some really very good shows. Did a couple more shows with Dixie Carter and Delta Burke, and she was a pretty strong, powerful executive of production in TV in that era.
And today, are there any Jewish women executives in the entertainment business? I do believe I looked this up a little while ago. There's a woman named Jennifer Salke, who was former president at NBC Entertainment and is now the head of Amazon Studios, I believe.
Yeah, I mean, there's these days, there's a pretty large number of women executives. Jewish women, that's a little harder for me to come up with at the top of the drop of a hat.
Someone would like to know, is there something in the Jewish character that has led to these media moguls and creators to become what they became? Is it just that we as fellow Jews, or just more attuned to them as successful entertainment moguls who happen to be, or is it that they happen to be just Jewish?
That's a very good question. And I don't know, I mean, you know, when Wally and I were talking about who we were going to talk about, we came up pretty easily with Silverman, Tartikoff, and Redstone. We weren't sure who the other person would be. And I thought, gee, it really should be, you know, Rupert Murdoch. Unfortunately, he's not Jewish. But, you know, Rupert Murdoch's story is very much like the classic, you know, immigrant story of, or like Redstone. You know, his Murdoch's father had a bit of an industry that was doing well over in Australia, and Murdoch went way beyond that. So no, I don't think there's anything special about Jews. I mean, it's just that if you go back more to the immigrant generation, like the people we talked about before, David Sarnoff, Bill Paley, you know, there's that burning desire to make it like, you know, George Jefferson, to move on up. That is part of the immigrant experience. I don't know that it's not Jewish experience. I think it's the immigrant experience. But the Jews have done pretty well in that field.
And actually, I like to jump in with two things. One, Ida Lupino is the name that I was blanking on from the 50s, but that gave me an excuse to, first of all, plug our book, which is Watching TV, 8 Decades of American Television. But I will balance that with a book called When Women Invented Television, which I would highly recommend, by Jennifer Keishan Armstrong. She did some books about Seinfeld and Sex and the City and all. And also the place I'm associated with, the Library of American Broadcasting Foundation, has a little niche of information, paperwork, biographies, etc., about women in broadcasting. Now, I have to go back and make that further subdivision of which of those are Jewish women in broadcasting.
Someone says that in the UK, the creator of Doctor Who was a Jewish woman. A question about
Oh, Verity Lambert. Yes. Okay. Yes.
So a question about All in the Family, though first someone gave a bit of trivia and said that All in the Family was the first time program where you heard a toilet flush. So
that is a favorite bit of trivia, and it's sort of a reminder of the different ways that you can be groundbreaking. The fact that they didn't do that before, and the short answer is no. There was an adaptation once of No Time for Sergeants. The novel turned into a movie, turned into a play, and there's a TV adaptation. There's a TV presentation of it, and they actually had to change the script so that they wouldn't show a urinal, even though an entire gag was built around the main character, played by Andy Griffith, having duty of cleaning the urinals. They just couldn't show that. So it was somehow too sensitive for viewers.
And of course, remember that All in the Family took a long time to get on the air. ABC had toyed around with the idea, and turned it down. CBS thought about it for a long time. They reshot the pilot a number of times, as we discussed at length in our book. And so it was pretty groundbreaking.
And that goes back to the importance of programming and presentation, which is, it was by no means an assured hit. It was something that could have been one and done, but instead, under the guidance of Silverman, was able to catch on and then become dominating in its decade, just like Cosby Show is dominating in its decade.
And we also really didn't mention that it's also sort of a lost art. Back when there were only 3 or 4 networks, the art of programming was very important, because really up until the era of VCRs, people could watch what was on the air. And so deciding what was on the schedule and what was going to follow what and so forth was a real art form that somebody like Silverman was a master at.
Mm-hmm. And so back to All in the Family, could you discuss some of the controversy with respect to All in the Family from a Jewish perspective? I remember that many Jewish people had problems with All in the Family.
There's so many moments in there. I'm going to go for the easy one and then a more subtle one. Sammy Davis Jr.
I was going to say that, yes.
Was one of the guest stars, and he wanted to be on All in the Family. And so what they did is they basically gave Archie a second job. That is, he used to drive off the book a cab. So that gave the excuse of him having Sammy Davis Jr. in his cab. So he was playing himself. And so there was a ethnic face-off between Archie and Sammy, which ended with a big kiss, with a photographer there taking a picture, Sammy Davis Jr. kissing Archie Bunker. The more subtle one, supposedly Archie Bunker was against, Jews amongst many other ethnic types. But one of the strengths of that series, and I think one of the reasons it lasted so long, is that he grew, he learned. And that was epitomized when it shifted over to becoming Archie Bunker's Place. That is when he bought the corner bar, and he had a Jewish partner when he first launched it, and that he and Edith adopted a young Jewish girl. So there was, and this was not just hidden in there. It was, they made a point of making that point, that Archie had learned, and you should too.
Mm-hmm. Do you have anything to say about Jeff Zucker?
Jeff Zucker would certainly be somebody else we would have liked to add if we had, unlimited time. Jeff Zucker, who's, it's now he's was famous for, being in charge of the Today Show and did a lot at NBC. And then has been over at Warner Brothers. And then the whole question is now what's going to happen to him now that, Warner Brothers is being acquired. And that's a good question. But Zucker has been probably the closest equivalent to these kind of characters of the more modern era. I mean, because Zucker has been at CNN for many years, and that's part of the Warner Media empire. And you know, he's done pretty well. There are people who like him and people who don't like him, and so forth. But I think he's got a pretty good track record, and you know, we'll see where he winds up after this current media shakeout.
And he also is one of those, and this is common with so many of the figures that we've been talking about, that he has brought people up with him. And that if he goes from one location to another, you know that he is going to remember them. And so he becomes a force beyond just wherever he happens to be standing at this moment. He's also someone who knows how the business works well, and has made it a point for television and media in general to be all that it can be.
Great. We're just going to take a few more questions. You talked about earlier that Seinfeld, it took about 5 seasons before it became a hit. Why do networks not give programs a chance anymore the way that they used to and pull them pretty quickly?
Because television isn't the way it used to be. And you also have to define, what do you mean by giving it a chance? Because if you drop 12 episodes as a streaming series, now what is giving it a chance? Promoting it heavily, going by word of mouth, etc. There are some instances in which clearly there was some commitment, they dropped the series and did nothing with it. That is, no one, you didn't hear of it dropping because they didn't tell anybody. So, but the same motivation, the same calculus, I should say, that was part of network television over the decades is still at play here. There, even if Netflix doesn't officially release a top 10, for example, they know what works and they know what doesn't. And so that is part of their calculus in terms of how much they'll promote something, how much they will support something in the long run if it comes back for a second or third batch of episodes. So they do and they don't, just like they did and didn't throughout television history.
Great. And finally, with cable and satellite TV, what's the future look like for network TV? And is there still anything special about network TV?
Oh, well, of course, Wally's the professor on future television, but I'll get in my 2 cents. You know, I think we are, like I said near the end, I think we are looking at a serious change in the way television works. I mean, just looking at the shows that are nominated for awards every year, the last couple of years, you hardly see any network television shows on there. Network television is not the home of shows these days that people are really talking about, and so you know, streaming is a lot more efficient and I think potentially lucrative for the producers and the studios and so forth. And it depends on how much people want to go with it. I mean, it's a question of how many streaming services do you want to pay for is a serious issue. But I think that the network television as we know it is going to be very, very different.
But the role that network television comes back to the owners of the network television services, because maybe famously going back to Sumner Redstone and Viacom and CBS, watch it any way you want, just watch our content. And so the networks still have they're still the bank for many people in terms of, if you're a producer and you're trying to get enough of a budget to create something that can be good for everybody, you could either start with someone who has a low threshold of financial support, or you can have someone who has the distribution set up and who has a bank account to draw from. And so network television will still be, the owners of network television stations will still be important, but not important in the same way.
Yeah, I mean, you're talking now about the owners. You're not talking about NBC, CBS, ABC, Fox. You're talking about Disney. You're talking about, you know, CBS Viacom. You're talking about, you know, NBC Universal, and the networks, the broadcast networks, and even are now just another offering, much like the cable channels and their various streaming services.
Great. Well, we have to go, but I thank you both very much for this walk down memory lane. I'm sure everybody enjoyed it, and we appreciate everybody joining us. Again, I want to remind folks to go to momentmag.com, where you can sign up for next week's Zoominar with former Israeli ambassador to the United States, Michael Oren. And as I said, you can also view Wally and Harry's first Zoominar about Jewish pioneers in television on our Zoominar webpage. Again, Harry, Wally, thank you so much, and we'll see everybody next time.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.